is a night watchman in this parking lot for a month now, and, from day to day, he was waiting for his salary. In general, the work was do not hit the recumbent. Sit down, watch the cars in the parking lot and spit out the window. Collia's predecessor was an old grandfather who slept in the gatehouse for almost the entire shift. But after the wheels were removed from several foreign cars at night, the old man was fired without paying the due salary. Therefore, in order not to repeat the fate of his predecessor, Collia never slept at night and, several times per shift, walked around the parking area. It was during one of these nightly rounds that he noticed the same car that had been in the parking lot since time immemorial. It was some old Ford, whose wheels were blown out a long time ago, and it stood literally on the same discs. Its tinted windows from long periods of inactivity were covered with a layer of dust and a dense blanket of dirt, reliably hiding the interior of the car from prying eyes. "I wonder what's inside? And what kind of poor fellow left him here?" Collia thought. This thought haunted the guy for several days. Several times, he approached the old Ford and wanted to pull the door handle towards him. But then, having come to his senses, Collia hurriedly left the car, afraid of being seen by someone. The guy hesitated for about a week before he finally decided to enter the salon of this old ruin. He was ready to swear that the owner of the Ford would never start it again and would not be able to leave the paid parking area without the help of a tow truck. Experience told Collia that the car was ownerless and no one cared about it. To carry out the plan, the guy decided at night. He knew that at such a time, there would be not a soul on the street and no one could interfere with him. Just in case, Collia took a screwdriver and a small pry bar with him in case he had to break the door. Around midnight, the guy left the lodge, and looking around, went to his goal. Collia had never had a chance to break into cars and, to put it mildly, he felt out of place. Grasping the door handle of the Ford, he carefully pulled it towards him at the same time. There was a characteristic click, which let Collia know that the car was not locked. That's luck. Didn't even have to crack. It happens. This old wreck stood for many years and no one even thought to look inside. The guy whispered admiringly. The door opened with a nasty rattle, and Collia's face smelled of mustiness and mold. Opening the rear passenger door, the guy saw that the cabin was completely empty. "Here you go. Just tried hard. Nothing interesting," the guy drawled disappointedly. Collia was about to close the doors of the Ford when the idea came to him to inspect the trunk. Of course, in the depths of his soul, he no longer expected to find anything worthwhile in him. But, when he nevertheless opened the trunk, a large black plastic bag immediately caught his eye. Collia carefully pulled the bag towards him and realized that it was not as heavy as it seemed. The neck of the bag was wrapped several times with twine, which immediately alerted Collia. "Interesting, but what is in it?" The guy thought, carefully untying the bag. Collia directed the beam of a flashlight at him and recoiled in horror. What the guy happened to see inside literally filled his heart with sticky fear and horror. And the point was that in the bag were skeletonized human remains. Most likely, during his lifetime, this man was beheaded and, later, lost his arms and legs. The dense base of the cellophane bag kept the remains of the victim securely, preventing the spread of the cadaverous smell. Collia could not say exactly how old these bones were, but according to the most conservative estimates, they were at least 2 or 3 years old. On the grinning skull of the corpse, hair and fragments of mummified skin are partially preserved. Looking more closely, Collia even noticed a golden crown in his upper jaw. On the surviving finger of the right hand, a ring made of white metal dangled at all. Judging by the color of the hair and the remnants of withered skin, during life, the deceased was a middle-aged man. There was no smell, as such, and if desired, Collia could freely rummage through the bones of this unknown corpse. But to explore the remains in more detail, the terrified guy, of course, did not. Instead, with trembling hands, he tied up the bag and tossed it back into the trunk. The bones clinked dully as they touched each other. causing Kolya to experience an irresistible urge to vomit. Slamming the trunk of the Ford, the guy looked around and ran as fast as he could to his lodge. Kolya's first thought was to call the boss and tell him everything, as if in spirit. He had already picked up the phone and raised his finger to the number headed Michaelik. But, then, having carefully thought everything over and waited, Kolya decided to abandon this idea. Well, what can I tell him? What? Out of nowhere, did I decide to get into an old car parked in the parking lot entrusted to me? For such tricks, I certainly will not be patted on the head. Especially before the payday, thought Kolya, and put the phone aside. Trying to recover from a terrible discovery, the guy tried to distract himself. But no matter how hard he tried, before his eyes there was still a terrible bag of bones and a skull bared in a deathly grin. It cost Kolya a lot of work to wait for the morning and hand over the shift to his partner. Well, what is it? Everything is fine, how can I see? Asked the chief, looking around the gatehouse. Yes, Michaelik. No incidents. Without blinking an eye, Kolya lied. In fact, his heart was ready to jump out of his chest at the mere thought of the bag of bones. Pulling himself together, the guy said goodbye and went home to sleep. To date, another night shift was waiting for him. In the depths of his soul, Kolya sincerely hoped that there would be no more such finds on his shift. To sleep during the day, Kolya did not really succeed. He lived with his mother and stepfather, who was constantly on the horns. So today, instead of giving the stepson a rest, he made a scandal with breaking dishes and shouting for the whole house. In order not to listen to his stepfather's drunken ravings, Kolya packed his backpack and left for work 3 hours ahead of schedule. Since his partner had to serve his shift to the end, Nikolai loitered around the parking lot, trying not to look at the old Ford, in the trunk of which a terrible secret was kept. The parking area was large and the number of cars standing on it was also large. Going around it up and down, Kolya noticed at least 3 more cars, similar to the one he got into last night. Of course, their technical condition was much better than the Ford with the bag of bones in the trunk. But on the other hand, it was evident from them that they had been standing for a long time. Just in case, Kolya marked them with chalk to see if they would be picked up from the parking lot or not. And also, the guy was surprised by the fact that the owner of the parking lot, Alexander Michaelik, did not call a tow truck in order to pick up this junk and make room for new customers. Does an extra penny hurt him? Yes, such businessmen like him, they will hang themselves for a penny. And he keeps junk in the parking lot for free, Kolya thought as he returned to the gatehouse. In the gatehouse, Kolya unobtrusively tried to find out from the day shift watchman who exactly owned the deadweight cars. But the shifter only shrugged his hands and said, "And how much? I know. Ask Michaelik. He's in charge of everything here." But, of course, Kolya did not ask the owner of the parking lot about strange cars. Instead, he decided that night to inspect the chalk-marked cars. Kolya himself could not understand why he was interfering in his own business. Most likely, the guy was haunted by the mystery associated with the discovery of human remains in the trunk. Having waited for the start of his shift, Kolya accompanied his partner and tried to find notes in the work log about possible owners of abandoned cars. To his chagrin, he found anything in the magazine, except for the mention of the names and surnames of the car owners he needed. "Well, I'll find out everything tonight," Kolya whispered, clenching his fists. This time, he no longer waited for midnight and, after dark, went to inspect cars. The first on his list was the battered Volga, the color of which, due to old age, was almost impossible to determine. Kolya carefully approached the car and immediately tried to open the trunk. If only it was closed. The guy whispered like a spell. To his chagrin, the trunk was not locked. Kolya carefully opened it and in the light of a flashlight, he saw exactly the same black plastic bag. "What's going on here?" flashed through the guy's brain. This time, Kolya did not look into the bag, but only slightly opened the neck. And at the same moment, a vile smell of carrion hit him in the nose. Apparently, the statute of limitations for these remains was not as long as that of the body from the old Ford. Already guessing what was waiting for him in the next two cars, Colia in turn examined their interior and trunk. The result of this was the discovery of two more bags of remains. Moreover, the weight of the latter was almost twice as heavy as the previous ones. Apparently, quite fresh, thought Nikolai with difficulty restraining his nausea. Now, the guy no longer doubted that he had gotten himself into a very bad story. In the parking lot guarded by him, in 4 cars, there were 4 dismembered corpses in varying degrees of decomposition. But Colia did not have time to finish his thought, because from the side of the road he heard the sound of a car engine driving into the parking lot. Out of surprise, Colia turned off the flashlight and hid behind the nearest SUV. Meanwhile, the car stopped at the gatehouse. Not wanting to betray his presence, Colia decided to watch from afar the strangers who had arrived in some old wreck. Soon, the car doors opened and 2 people got out of the car. One of them, Colia recognized immediately. "Why, it's Alexander Mikulik, the owner of the parking lot," the guy whispered in surprise. He was about to leave his hiding place, when suddenly he heard a conversation between the chief and his acquaintance. "Don't worry, you are. Everything will be okay. He's a complete dick. He knows nothing about our business. In principle, you can take it. Well, you know better. But be that as it may, the sacrifice must be made today," Mikulika's companion croaked. At that moment, Colia swallowed his viscous saliva and covered himself with cold sweat from head to toe. "This is a parking lot. Yes, this is a real tin," flashed through the guy's brain. In the meantime, Mikulik went into the lodge and, not finding Colia in it, began to call him. "Hey Nikolai. Why aren't you at your workplace? Where are you anyway?" The guy did not want to respond at all, especially since he knew that his employer, most likely, was not at all the one he claims to be. The owner of the parking lot called Colia one more time, but there was still no answer. Then, together with an assistant, they dragged a man bound hand and foot out of the car and threw him onto an oilcloth prudently laid on the asphalt. Then, Mikulik and his henchmen put on strange robes and began to chant some kind of prayer in Kolia's unfamiliar language. Probably, this is a sect. Some kind, the guy thought anxiously. He could not escape, because the parking lot was surrounded by a high fence, climbing over which was almost impossible. In the meantime, the men in overalls fell silent abruptly and pulled huge cleavers, similar to machetes, out of the passenger compartment of the car. At the sight of their formidable weapons, the man began to crawl on the oilcloth, as if anticipating an imminent death. At the same moment, Mikulik turned the captive on his back and, exhaling abruptly, cut off his head with one blow. Scarlet blood spattered, which sprinkled the oilcloth in a terrible fountain. The body of the unfortunate still by inertia beat in agony for several seconds, after which it finally calmed down, and people in overalls began to chop the unfortunate man into pieces and put them in a pre-prepared plastic bag. From everything he saw, Colia became ill. The guy instinctively recoiled and touched the fender of an expensive foreign car, whose sensitive signaling instantly announced the area with its piercing howl. People in overalls looked in the direction of the source of the sound, and Colia immediately felt uneasy. "Hey little one. Come here. Don't be afraid. We won't touch you. We have already made a sacrifice," Mikulik said in an unctuous tone. "Yet. Found a fool. You will quickly cut me into belts. Just tell me one thing. Why are you doing all this?" Colia asked, stepping back. "What? You didn't realize?" "Oh, you dumb-headed sucker. Many centuries ago, on the side of this parking lot, there was an altar at which the servants of the devil made human sacrifices. According to the ritual, the bodies of the sacrificed should be next to the altar. So I bought this parking lot, on the territory of which, once a month, I made human sacrifices to the devil, hiding their bodies in the trunks of old cars. And what? Quickly and conveniently, Michael answered with a grin. And only now Kolya understood the whole nightmare of the current situation. There was simply nowhere for Kolya to run. Michael blocked the only exit from the parking lot with his creepy henchman. The guy understood that soon. The Satanists would corner him and cut him to pieces with their nightmarish cleavers. Frantically looking for a way out, Kolya took off his shirt, one end of which he set on fire, and the other lowered into the gas tank of the car closest to him. The guy acted more instinctively than consciously. Kolya knew that the explosion of the fuel tank would cause a large-scale fire, which could hurt himself, but now he did not care at all. After the explosion was heard, the parking lot turned into a fiery hell in a few seconds. Kolya himself did not remember how he was able to get to the exit through a dense ring of fire and smoke. The guy's body was covered with severe burns, which plunged him into a state of deep shock. And when the fire was extinguished, the firemen were very surprised that, in addition to the deceased owner of the paid parking lot and his friend, the remains of several people were found in the parking area at once. And only Kolya, lying in the ward of the burn center, knew what was going on. But, despite this, he chose not to give out this terrible secret, intending to forget it as soon as possible.